The sky above the prairie burned with the kind of heat that made the horizon waver like water, the kind of heat that pressed into a body until it stole not only sweat but hope, and Emma Carter trudged forward through the endless grasses with her baby cradled against her chest, her feet dragging as though the earth itself sought to claim her, her breath catching in shallow gasps as the weight of exhaustion bore down heavier than the sun itself, her mind fogged with the constant chorus of her son's hungry cries. And yet she pressed on because stopping meant surrender and surrender meant death, and death was not something she could allow, not when James's tiny heart beat against her like a drum that demanded she keep moving no matter how much her bones screamed to collapse, and so she staggered until her knees gave way and she sank into the tall grass, her skirts tangling around her legs, her arms clutching James close as he wailed with the desperation that pierced the air like a blade, and she whispered apologies into his damp curls, her cracked lips trembling as she promised him food she did not have, comfort she could not give, and prayed silently though her prayers had felt unanswered for days, her faith battered by hunger and loneliness, and as the prairie wind whispered over her bent form she wondered if this patch of grass would be her grave, if James's last cries would fade unheard beneath the vast indifference of the sky. But then she felt a vibration in the ground, faint at first, then growing stronger, a rhythm her tired mind almost mistook for her own pulse until she realized it was steadier, louder, the unmistakable beat of hooves approaching from somewhere beyond the rise, and she lifted her head with effort, her sun-stung eyes narrowing against the glare until she saw him, a lone rider cresting the horizon, horse and man outlined sharp against the searing light. A silhouette of straight-backed certainty that seemed carved out of the very fabric of the West, and though fear curled inside her because strangers could mean danger as often as salvation, a hope surged all the same, a fragile, reckless hope that maybe, just maybe, Providence had heard her after all, and the figure grew larger as the rider urged his mount forward, dust rising in his wake, the long fall of a coat brushing the horse's flanks as he rode with a steadiness that spoke of long miles and longer burdens, until at last he drew close enough for her to see his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, a face lined not with cruelty but with the weathering of wind and sun, and eyes that softened, almost imperceptibly, as they took in the sight of her huddled in the grass with her crying child, and he slowed his horse, swung down with the ease of a man who belonged more in the saddle than on the ground, and approached with careful steps, the leather of his boots creaking, his presence both imposing and strangely gentle as he stopped before her and let the silence hang for a moment broken only by James's cries, before he shrugged off his coat and crouched to drape it around her shoulders, the fabric heavy and warmed with the scent of leather, dust, and faint traces of horse, and she blinked up at him, lips too dry to shape words, eyes stinging not only from the sun but from the sting of tears she could not hold back, and he studied her, then the child, and when he finally spoke his voice was low, steady, carrying the calm strength of a river cutting through stone. "You look about done in, ma'am," he said, not as judgment but as fact, and Emma, who had held herself together with little more than stubborn will for days, felt the fragile dam of her composure crack, a sob tearing loose as she clutched James closer, and the cowboy, for there was no mistaking him for anything else with that steady gaze and the grit of the plains clinging to him, extended his arms slowly, not demanding but offering, and said, "Let me hold him a spell," and though instinct made her hesitate, clutching her child tighter against her chest, there was something in his eyes, something like steady kindness, something she had nearly forgotten existed that made her relent, her arms trembling as she handed her son over to the stranger, and the moment James settled against his broad chest, his cries softened, hiccuping into little gasps before finally quieting to whimpers as though even the child recognized the safety in those arms, and Emma watched in disbelief as the man rocked the baby with a natural ease, his big hands supporting the small body with surprising gentleness, and he glanced down at James, then back at her, and said softly, "There now, little fella, no need to wear yourself out, I reckon we'll see you right," and when he looked at him again his gaze was steady as bedrock. "I've got bread and jerky in my saddlebag, and milk too. I was heading into town to sell it, but looks like you need it more than any store does. and Emma's lips parted but only a broken whisper came out, "Thank you," before tears spilled free, hot and unrestrained, the relief nearly buckling her, and for a long moment she could only sit there in the grass, cloak wrapped around her shoulders, watching as this stranger, this cowboy who had appeared like an answer from the dust, soothed her starving child, and when he finally extended his hand toward her, rough and calloused but steady as stone, and said, "Come on, ma'am, let's get you both fed. You've walked far enough alone," she took it, because in that moment she knew she had no strength left to refuse. And when his hand pulled her gently to her feet, the prairie wind seemed to shift, no longer whispering of despair but of something new, something she did not yet dare name but could not ignore, and as he guided her toward the waiting horse, the sun glinting off the horizon, Emma Carter felt for the first time in a long while that the road ahead, though uncertain, might not be one she had to walk alone.